So first of all, I would of course like to thank the organizers for having me at this very interesting conference and to invite me to come and talk to you about my recent research into Pithekoussan amphorae. And unlike many of our speakers, I don't have a long pedigree in amphorae studies, but nevertheless, I hope to contribute to the debate with some new ideas and hypotheses. So in a recent article, I have postulated that it is necessary to rethink the repertoire of locally produced amphorae dated to the 8th and 7th centuries BCE on the island of Pithekoussai, better known as Ischia in the Bay of Naples today. And my main incentive for revisiting the assemblage was born out of a broader analysis of economic interaction in the Iron Age Mediterranean, and specifically regarding specifically regarding the general presumption that Greek colonization during that period was at least partially economically motivated. A lot of debate surrounds the question to what extent we can really use terms like trade and market and transactions in the context of modernist versus primitivist models about economy in the Iron Age Mediterranean. I will not delve too much into detail about this, but will focus here on my recent hypothesis regarding the amphorae production on Pithekoussai itself and its implications in terms of cultural change and the transfer of knowledge between East and West, which eventually is the subject of our conference. The vast majority of amphorae was excavated in a necropolis where they were discovered to have been used as a recipient for what we call enkitrismos burials, so burials for infants. And since the start of the excavations in the 1950s, over 90 pieces have been recorded. The volcanic activity on Ischia and the high temperatures registered in the soil at the time of the excavation has resulted, unfortunately, in the loss of the majority of the amphorae. Another factor to keep in mind in this discussion is that only a part of the evidence has been studied and published, and the rest is not. So conclusions are therefore necessarily preliminary and need future testing. Nevertheless, the locally produced amphorae have received substantial attention since the moment of their discovery. The original excavators distinguished between a not very standardized local amphorae type A, being produced in the mid-8th century and after that, which was replaced eventually by a type B in the second half of the 7th century BCE. In addition to these known types, another local type, COLLO CILINDRICO, which is not on the slide, but we will look at it later, was described. And it was also noted that the local types of amphorae were indebted to a group of amphorae variously labeled as Phoenician, colonial, but without a single one ancestor immediately standing out. More recent studies have brought small improvements to the initial typological division through the identification of a number of variants to the main types. Valentino Nizzo, followed by Jean-Christophe Sourisseau, proposed variations within the type A group with a subtype alpha, in which lip is slightly elongated, or with the subtype vita, the presence of a short neck. The variations are considered to be too isolated in the case of subtype alpha, or too chronologically dispersed in the case of subtype vita, to be placed in an evolutionary typochronological scheme. As I mentioned earlier, it were initially questions regarding economic organization at Pithekoussai that induced me to look in more detail at the published repertoire of the locally produced amphorae. In this process, I observed that despite the indisputable importance of the initial publication by Buchner and Ridgway, the basic documentation of the amphorae stood as incomplete, to the extent of preventing even a simple systematic visual inspection and comparison between the different attested pieces. For example, some amphorae were measured at the time of the excavation, but they were not preserved afterwards, and thus they were never drawn or photographed. Other amphorae were measured, but they were not restored subsequently, and as a result, they were not drawn or photographed in the final publication. Even the material that was preserved, restored, and published presents difficulties because some amphorae, for whatever reason, were only photographed but not drawn. And drawings and photographs were published without scale. Drawings in the publication were seemingly made by different people who use different standards. So there are different or subtle differences between the recorded details, and some drawings include profiles and others don't. The photographs that were taken during the processing of the finds after the excavation, presumably somewhere in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and the quality is not what one would expect in the 21st century. So, and all these lacunae come, of course, on top of the specimens that were too fragile at the time of excavation to be documented in any detail at all. So hence the need for a restudy of this material. At the most basic level, a higher degree of comparability of the evidence can be achieved by unifying the documentation. In the absence of archaeometrical analysis of clay or a complete and new documentation of the evidence, which is actually urgently necessary, I would advocate. An easy and cost-effective solution that I have adopted has been to digitize and redraw the amphorae whose pictures were included in the original publication by Buchner and Ridgway. Obviously, making drawings from photographs results in small errors, but a unified set of profile drawings allows a comparison, I would say, at least of basic morphological traits. And the next step I took was to order all the morphological information in a chronological sequence, which was based on the stratigraphic matrix of the excavations reconstructed by Valentino Nizzo. If you want more details about this, it's published in an article. I'm not going to go into too many details about stratigraphy or reconstructions. However, using the methods, it has become possible to identify similarities and differences between amphorae, which might suggest, at least that's my hypothesis, that there were different related groups, which I will briefly present on the following slides, and I refer to the publication for more details. Within the type A group, traditional type A, there is a possible group of larger amphorae with a height of around 60-64 centimeters and a width of around 41-42 centimeters. They have a slightly projecting rim on a hardly perceivable neck, and the handles are lower for the on the shoulder, lower for the earlier attestation, higher for the later attestation. And it's possible that there's one piece that could be a half size. It's the piece on at least my right, T444, and that is if the full size is calculated at 67 centimeters. Second group is composed of amphorae of around 50 to 55 centimeters high and with a diameter between 35 and 40 centimeters. It seems to be the largest group attested, and they have a thick projecting rim, but with variations in the height of the short neck, which is sometimes more and sometimes less articulated. It's not entirely clear whether the specimen from tomb 540 should be included in this group, because with a height of 38 centimeters, it's smaller than the others, but the shape of the rim is very close to the example from tomb 341, which comes from a possibly related level. A third group has the same size as the previous group, but is distinct for the absence of a neck. This is slightly less pronounced in the case of tomb 343, but even here the rim is closer to the shoulders than in the previous group. A possible fourth group is composed of amphorae with a height of around 50 centimeters and a diameter of 34 to 37.5 centimeters. There's one specimen that had already been identified as a variant. The specimen from tomb 629 is irregular, which is possibly due to a mishap during firing, but the preserved frame, at least on the right, seems to place it in the same group. Group 5 could be a series of later amphorae with a height of around 57 centimeters and a width of around 41 centimeters. And a possible sixth group, currently only attested through a single specimen, was already classified as a variant to the A type. In terms of size, it conforms to groups 2, 3, and 4, but the height of the neck places is more in class 4, but the rim is projecting outward instead of inward. Hence my suggestion that it might be a different group. In the so-called type B, there is a first group of amphorae with a height of around 50.5 to 53.5 centimeters and a width of 35 to 39.5 centimeters. There's one specimen from tomb 274, which is wider, but this might also be the result of a firing mishap. A second group has slightly larger amphorae with a height of 53 to 57 centimeters and a width between 40.5 and 42.6 centimeters. The profile is less curved than those of the previous group, and it does not display a distinct shoulder or neck. And a possibly third group of this type B division can be identified in two specimens whose clay has been described as similar. Unfortunately, only one profile has been published. The recorded size of one of the two pieces in this group shows that it might be closer to group 2, but the profile appears to be closer to group 1. So it's not entirely clear whether this should be a separate group or not, but it's a possibility, a suggestion indeed, which should be tested, of course. Among the type called COLLO CILINDRICO, there's a first group of amphorae around 56-57 centimeters high and a diameter around 40-44 centimeters wide. A second group here is smaller, with a height up to 50 to 53 centimeters and a width between 38.6 and 41.6 centimeters. There's one rim that's slightly more protruding than the other. So again, small variations that do exist within these groups as well. And a possible third group might be recognized in a larger amphorae around 70 centimeters high and with a diameter of 45 centimeters. There's one published profile which shows a slightly flaring neck with a small rim. And Buchner and Ridgway remarked that the piece in tomb 400 looks like tomb 430, excuse me, and tomb 440. But the latter is smaller and according to me fits better in group 1. So to summarize, previous research had identified Pithekoussai as the location of a not very standardized amphorae production. The detailed analysis presented here and based on purely morphological characteristics leads to the suggestion that several different groups of morphologically similar amphorae existed. Archaeometric analysis has not been conducted and would be needed to confirm these hypothetical groups, but I think that the least that can be said is that even though the global aspect of the entire assemblage does not look massively standardized, there is more logic and standardization in the production than was previously assumed. Ethnographic studies have documented that small variations in morphology can exist even in the output of highly trained potters. So this makes the suggestion of different workshops on Pithekoussai, I would think, a plausible one, but one that has to be verified and refined, of course, in future studies. A chart on the slides with a chronological distribution of the different morphological groups indicates that there are two groups operating simultaneously in the very beginning of the sequence. I'm not sure if you can see my arrow on the screen. I'm trying to point it out to you. And according to the current state of the evidence, at least, it appears that we have several groups operating here in this middle section, roughly between levels 20, 25, slightly before, slightly after, and with some possible outliers, maybe due to problematic stratigraphy rather than being an actual fact. And we also see in a chronological chart that type B, as had been observed before, is chronologically distinct and isolated as a group. So these observations bring me to the second part of my presentation, in which I will attempt to reflect on a broader picture and specifically questions of production and technology transfer, but also consumption and modes of circulation. Amphorae constitute a quite sudden innovation in the pottery repertoire in the Bay of Naples and have been linked to colonization movements. I want to argue that while it is tempting to attribute the sudden invention of these amphorae to trade relations established by colonists, the evidence suggests a more complex picture in which the transfer of technology is embedded in broader networks of mobility of various forms, economic transformations leading to the commodification of labor and goods, but also the creation of new forms of capital and probably debts, as well as the transformation in systems of normative behavior and display. I want to argue that all of these aspects are highly important and need to be taken into consideration if we are going to try to make sense of questions as to why these amphorae appear in this region in the first place. Recent research by Gloria Olcese has suggested that Pithekoussan clay was mined from the center of the island. This would imply that mining clay, preparing paste, baking amphorae, and transporting them to wine production facilities was labor intensive, and most probably could not be executed by one person only. This means that different parts of the chaîne opératoire were highly specialized and must have been executed by different specialists and their aides. We do not know who owned raw clay resources, who owned vineyards, or production facilities for wine for which the amphorae were eventually used. The presence of different morphological groups of amphorae indicates that the scale of wine production became more intensified and better organized over time, and parallels with other sites which suggest that amphorae production was located in the vicinity of wine production or storage facilities. These have not yet been excavated on Pithekoussai, but examples possibly from Roman or medieval times have been documented by Gloria Olcese on the island. And the rural structure excavated at Punta Chiarito on Pithekoussai, from which you see an artistic impression and reconstruction on the slide. They could have been part of a network of wine producers, as also Jean-Christophe Sourisseau has suggested in the past. The context yielded evidence of storage facilities in a visible part of the structure, which is a fact to which I will return later. The gradual increase in amphorae production groups, which we observed earlier, could suggest that the industry was expanding. And in addition to looking at production, we can also look at consumption patterns. And I have used network analysis to see how different family groups, which are spatially and stratigraphically attested in the necropolis, deposit amphorae in burial. And you see here the representation on the slide. The available evidence seems to suggest that access to amphorae was restricted, because not all burial groups, which are the red dots, and here on the side are those that have no amphorae, So we see that not all groups had access or deposited amphorae in burial. Through time, we see that the use of amphorae spreads, but not evenly. And one logic explanation is, of course, that not all family groups had infants to bury. But on the other hand, we also find infant burials in pits and other containers. And this suggests conscious choice, maybe based on personal beliefs, but it might also indicate shortage. And I am inclined to favor the latter interpretation because our evidence shows that family groups who use amphorae to bury infants sometimes use other vessels or pit burial. So this could indicate that there were no amphorae available when it was needed for burial. If this suggestion is a viable one, then this could lead to a next hypothesis, that of the fact that the production of amphorae was limited in time and capacity, and there could be periodic shortages, especially in the earlier phases. And this would also explain the gradual need for expansion of the industry. A second aspect of amphorae production, which I would like to highlight, is the intimate link between the production of the amphorae and the consumption of wine on Pithekoussai. I have in previous work looked at consumption patterns of different vessel types in these burials, and our evidence suggests that the family groups that had privileged access to amphorae also had privileged access to drinking vessels. Anthropologists call this diacritical feasting, and classicists describe it as the symposium. A detailed study of chronological evolution of the consumption patterns show that it's definitely a gradual spread of Aegean-style drinking vessels, which are initially imported from the Aegean, but eventually also locally produced. And this transformation is caused by the adoption of the wine consumption practices taking place over the course of several generations. So I want to stress the time aspect, but which would eventually, of course, end up having a dramatic effect on the local pottery assemblage, as well as local practices on the long term. Before moving to my last and probably most contentious point about technological transfer and mobility, I want to dwell a little more on consumption patterns and modes of circulation. Amphorae are very often and without a second thought linked by scholars to phenomena of trade. And studying the entire chaîne opératoire in Pithekoussai allows to observe its gradual expansion, which is indeed most likely led to an increased commodification of labor and goods during the various stages in the economic process. But our evidence also suggests much more. Iconographic, as well as historical and archaeological evidence, suggests that the capacity to store goods was used for visible display and competition. Homer describes Odysseus' treasure chamber as high-roofed, a wide room where gold and bronze lay piled, and raiment in chests and stores of fragrant oil. And there too, he says, stood great jars of wine, old and sweet, holding within them an unmixed divine drink, and ranged in order along the wall. In Zagora, in the Aegean, archaeological evidence indicates that storage jars were placed within a very, very visible spot in the house. And on Pithekoussai itself, at the rural site of Punta Chiarito, as I have just mentioned, the excavations have revealed that storage capacity was also put on a visible display in the house. From the site of Monte Vetrano, not very far from Ponte Cagnano, so south along the Campanian coast, we have a lyre player seal. It's depicting a comos scene centered on a large amphorae, and it's understood as depicting the central role of wine consumption in funerary rites in the region. And all these observations are entirely in line with what Norma Di Sandro proposed already many years ago, namely that the flat bottom of the locally produced Pithekoussan amphorae facilitated their use for display rather than for transportation. This brings me to my last collection of thoughts about technology and transfer. Studies of technology and transfer of technology suggest that intimate settings of substantial interaction need to exist in order for complex technologies such as pottery production to be transmitted successfully. These communities of practice are clearly attested on Pithekoussai. As far as the current state of our evidence allows to discern, there was no substantial period of trial and error in the development of Pithekoussan amphorae. The type is clearly derived from existing technologies of making storage jars that were already known in the Bronze and the early Iron Age, as we were able to hear in the papers on the previous day. The limited repertoire on Pithekoussai also suggests that the technology was transferred, at least that's how I see it, was transferred relatively quickly, and that people who acquired the technology initially transferred it further down to others. And this, in my view, implies mobility of an individual or a small group of individuals for a reasonable amount of time. On the other hand, I don't think it points to a continuous stream of incoming foreign potters. At the same time, I think we need to observe that the production was efficiently integrated and able to tap into existing networks of exploitation. So this would suggest that mobility was managed in one way or another, and probably by what anthropologists call entrepreneurial individuals, local leaders who assume a primary role in managing economic and political interaction and social norms.
Liv, 1 minute.
Yes,
you
yes,
have 1 minute.
I'm nearly finished. I'm nearly finished.
Please.
Okay, so what was I saying? So these entrepreneurial individuals, local leaders who assume a primary role in managing economic and political interaction, I said that. So while allowing innovation to come in, the innovation was not available to the entire population, but carefully managed in a system that expanded over time and was primarily oriented to local interests based on the island and its immediate surroundings. So this would argue against colonial trade as the primary rationale behind the development of amphorae and Pithekoussai. Several specimens have been found outside of Pithekoussai, but the vast majority still comes from the island itself. And scholars are becoming increasingly interested in the phenomenon of repurposing amphorae in burials, as we also saw in an earlier presentation today. So representing wealth and abundance in life, the amphorae could be reused in burial to extend a message of prosperity in afterlife. Amphorae, therefore, as I have argued, need to be seen as a multi-purpose technology, a commodity, a means of payment, a way to store capital, a tool for display, and an item for dedication and communication with the gods. Our evidence suggests that only gradually they would become the cheap marker of commodity trade and colonial exploitation with which we connect the amphorae in later periods. I have done.